טוב, עכשיו שסיימנו את שלושת הרצאות הפתיחה, אני חושב שנוצר בסיס מצוין לדיונים הפרטניים. אני מצטער לסכם את הפרק הזה בלומר שאני לוקח את הדברים השונים שהוצגו כאן, שיש לנו הרבה מה לעשות, אוקיי? בלשון המעטה. וזה, מצד אחד זה כמובן מצער ומאתגר, אבל מצד שני זה נותן לנו מוטיבציה וסיבה טובה להמשיך בעבודה. אני רוצה עכשיו להתחיל את הישיבות, את הדיונים של הפאנלים השונים. אני מזמין בבקשה את ידידי מר אבי שנור, המייסד של EIS, לרכז את הצוות של שלושת האנשים שהוא הולך לנהל אותם בשעה הקרובה, מעכשיו עד שעה 11:30, אז אנחנו נסיים את העניין ויהי מה. בסדר? אז בבקשה.
אז בוקר טוב. רציתי להתחיל להודות עמוס, מאיר, במכון בשביל כל עבודה, לעשות, לסדר את הכנס הזה. תודה רבה, מאוד חשוב, הייתי אומר. אז ברשותכם, אני רוצה להחליף באנגלית. Good morning. Thanks to everyone for coming. Thank you, Amos. Thank you, Mayor, for arranging this conference. So I will speak briefly. I'd like to introduce the subject of this session. The subject of the session is resiliency as a leading paradigm in managing mega disasters. So that sounds like an obvious statement, and it's easy to be deceived into thinking that this is an easy call. If we're talking about huge disasters, obviously resilience must be very important. It turns out it's actually quite complex, as you'll also hear, I believe, from the other members of the panel. Let me start by providing some context. So we've already heard from several speakers, everything we do, the lives of the people in our society, everything that we use, society itself, it all depends on a series of interlocked, very efficient infrastructures, more efficient than at any time in history. Water, transportation, communication, all of the things that we've come to depend on. And all of these infrastructures, let's call them societally critical infrastructures, or perhaps simpler would be lifeline infrastructures. These infrastructures all sit on one common foundation, as we've also heard this morning, and that common foundation is the power grid. Now, if we're talking about huge disasters, mega disasters, almost by definition, we're talking about disasters which involve destroying this network of critical lifeline infrastructures, and destroying it for a long time, and destroying it for over an area which is very extensive. And not only the critical infrastructures that we depend on, water, food, communication, transportation, finance, but of course, the power grid that underlies it all. Now, an important question that arises, certainly when beginning to think about this, is how can this be? How can this be a problem? We haven't seen mega disasters like this. And if there are such things, and we do need to worry about this, why haven't we seen them? So I think this requires some historical perspective. If you look through history, the human history runs maybe 3,000, 3,500 years, certainly recorded history. Throughout history, there have been regularly disruptions, destructions of infrastructures throughout the world, towns, cities. The difference is, in almost all of history, infrastructures were local affairs. If you destroy an infrastructure in one town, maybe you even burn the town down, very likely your neighboring town is going to survive. So there's a difference today. And the difference is that our infrastructures have now become national affairs and even beyond national, even international. Not only are infrastructures much larger, but they are organic, everything is interconnected, and these interconnected infrastructures now are absolutely required for everything that society does. I think it's possible in one sense to look at it this way. We have the sense, okay, so in modern times, we haven't seen these mega disasters that have destroyed our infrastructures. Modern times actually are not very long. If you go back only 90 years, there was no power grid anywhere in the world. In the United States, the first small steps toward building a power grid began 90 years ago. I think it's possible to look at modern infrastructures and the power grid as an example as today in what I would call the beta test mode. And it hasn't been around long enough for us to have experienced the kind of problems that we've experienced throughout the rest of history. So there are two basic elements then. Let me just summarize the context for everything that we're talking about in this panel. First of all, we now depend on massive interconnected organic infrastructures. And secondly, we're dealing with infrastructures which are relatively new, and there really has not been time to see the kinds of problems that could bring these infrastructures down. So given this context, let me come back to the assumption that I started with, resilience. Shouldn't it be easy to say, I mean, what is the point here? We should be able to say, so resilience is a critical and essential part of dealing with big disasters. So there is a problem, and the problem is, in spite of the fact that this seems obvious, as we just heard from the last speaker, from all of the speakers, there are issues. We're not at the point of having achieved this resilience, so why not? So I submit there is a fundamental problem, and the problem is this. If you look at governments and you look at large organizations and companies, they always use the same paradigm to address threats. They always operate using a reactive paradigm. Now, you could say it would be nice, it would be better to be proactive, but in fact, a reactive paradigm is very effective. You see events happen, you see crises occur, you react to the crisis. You have a crisis that occurs many times, you gradually learn what is the best way to deal with it. It is so effective that that is almost exclusively the way governments, the way large companies behave. So that's the issue that we need to work with. What we need to do is we need to change the paradigm from a reactive paradigm to a resilient, proactive paradigm. We're in the process of beginning to achieve that. We've made some steps here in Israel, internationally, in the United States, but it's only beginning. So what is the risk then? If we need to change paradigms and we're only beginning to do that, what is the risk and what direction do we need to go? So I suggest that the first thing that has to be done is to make sure we're asking and responding to the right question. So when you talk about very serious threats, there are many, many interesting questions that one could ask that could lead to an enormous amount of research over very, very long durations. Universities, NGOs, people could have a lot of fun doing all the research into all the different kinds of questions that could be asked. I submit that those are not the interesting questions that we need to work on. Interesting and important questions are questions that relate directly to what do we need to do? What are the steps we need to take? And that's a critical subject, because asking the wrong questions can just push this whole subject downstream. And I will supply an example of what I would call the right question. As we look at society today, as we look at where we are today, are we prepared to say that very severe threats should be, that we should respond to very severe threats and we should deal with these as issues that can prevent severe disasters to our countries, to our civilizations? Or should we say this is something that we can tolerate, we'll live with this risk? So if you're sitting here today, probably you would guess that the answer I'm going to suggest is no. We cannot tolerate a situation where we don't make at least minimal investments to be prepared to deal with very severe threats. So where are we then, and what are these severe threats? So I think they've been summarized by several of the speakers. But I think one important point is that not every threat qualifies as something that could bring down our infrastructures. There are 4 or 5 examples that I think are primary. We've heard cyber, we've heard EMP, or there's a natural version of EMP, physical attacks either by terrorists or by missiles. There's a relatively small number of events which could be so severe that they could risk bringing down our infrastructures. As we look at where we are against each of these threats, it's very important to measure where we are in 2 different dimensions of resilience. Because if we're going to change paradigms, so we're moving from a reactive paradigm to a resilient, proactive paradigm, there are 2 dimensions of that resilience. One is, what do we need to do to prepare so that before it happens, we have the tools we'll need to respond? And second is, how do we plan the response? Both dimensions of resilience are absolutely essential. If you make the mistake of not providing enough advance preparation, you won't have the tools to respond. If you do at least a minimal level of preparation, you will have the tools for response, but you'll find that you need to have very, very sophisticated, extensive planning to be able to accomplish an effective recovery. So these 2 subjects work together, but most critical is at least to make a minimal investment so that you'll be capable of putting together a response after you have one of these severe crises. So to conclude, let me just offer a perspective on where we are against this small set of very severe crises. Cyber, I think we're really doing reasonably well. At least we're all engaged, the various Western countries, certainly Israel, the United States, other countries, in putting up what I would call cyber fences. That does, unfortunately, leave a very large gap. And people are just beginning in the cyber world to think that there is another dimension of resilience which is receiving not very much attention. And that is, what are the resilience measures we need to invest in to deal with a successful cyber attack? In other words, one of the things we heard this morning is cyber attacks are getting so sophisticated and so numerous, we cannot necessarily count indefinitely on being able to stop them. So as we invest in stopping them, which is important and critical, we need to begin thinking about making the investments that will make it possible for us to recover from them. That's a newer subject. EMP. So work is beginning here in Israel. Work is beginning in the United States addressing EMP, both in terms of resilience investments that are needed and in terms of preparations and response. Important things have been done. But in terms of where we are today, I have to say we're not in good condition. We're not in good shape. If there were an EMP attack today in one of the major Western nations, it would be more than an extremely serious problem. Severe earthquakes. So earthquakes are an example of a very critical natural crisis that could occur, that could bring down infrastructures broadly. Depending on where you are, different locations, there is more preparation, less preparation in different locations. But this is an area where response and proper preparations are going to be absolutely critical. That's one of the reasons for a focus on earthquakes here in Israel, because no matter how much preparation you do, there's a limit to how far you can go. You have to have a very sophisticated response capability. The same is true in terms of physical attack. It's going to be crucial that we have a very good capability to rapidly respond to physical attack, whether it's from missiles, whether it's from terrorists. because there's a limit to what you can do in terms of resilience. So that concludes my remarks. I hope that introduces the subject of why it is that, although it seems easy to think about resilience as an important requirement for big disasters, unfortunately, we're not there yet, and we have not achieved resilience against the 4 or 5 or 6 very, very critical threats that could bring down, for long durations, our critical infrastructures. So with that, I'd like to turn to different speakers. Since you're standing, Arnold, perhaps we'll begin with you. So Professor Arnold Howitt is Executive Director of the Ash Center for Democratic Government and Innovation at Harvard Kennedy School. He also co-directs the program on crisis leadership at Harvard Kennedy School. And he's involved in leadership training and crisis management really throughout the world in locations as far away as China. Thank you very much.
Colby?